Today we're going to talk about typical gaming behavior, bot or human, because you know that person in the game with you may not be human. Well, we'll get into that. I'm Steve Peterson. I'm the CEO of StoryPHORCE Entertainment, and I'll be moderating this panel. With us, we have Katie Hutcherson-Madding. She's Global Product Director for Adjust, and Yaron Oliker. He's the co-founder and CEO of Unbotify. And I'll let you each talk about your role and what you do in this space of bots and humans and mobile games.
Yeah, so I know, super exciting right after lunch, talking about bots and fraud, but I promise you won't be disappointed. So I work at a company called Adjust, and we are a mobile marketing solution. So basically, when you're running all of your marketing campaigns, advertising, we're able to show you your performance, track that, optimize it, build audiences, and then why we're here today is we also offer fraud prevention. And we recently acquired Unbotify, and I'll let Yaron speak to that.
Yeah, so Unbotify is a company we founded about 3.5 years ago in the space of cybersecurity and fraud detection. And we basically help our customers understand if a user on your app is a bot or a human. We do that by collecting all the sensor data from the device, like how you tap or swipe and how you hold the device on a mobile phone, sensors like gyroscope, accelerometer. And then what we do is we build a model with machine learning of how authentic interaction looks like. And we use that to detect anomalies, because for these bots and fraud tools, it's very hard to fake this kind of interaction. So in the context of gaming, we're working with some of the largest gaming studios in the world, helping them clean out their community from people who are cheating, using bot services to cheat or gain an unfair advantage in the game, and that's Unbotify.
So, Katie, can you frame for us just how big a problem is this? Is this, you know, a significant amount of money that we should be concerned about, and a significant amount of cheating that's going on?
Yeah, so it's pretty funny because when we began offering our fraud prevention suite, the majority of our clients were, oh, we're not affected by that. We never see fraud kind of in our spend and our KPIs. They're all solid, right? And in 2019, digital ad spend is supposed to be around $88 billion. Based on what Adjust has measured, which is a small portion of this ecosystem, we expect around $29 billion in fraud, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
On top of that, just from our clients and our gaming clients that we've been tracking, we have seen on average $2 million in savings from fraud rejection a day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That would pay a fair number of salaries to take care of. So you can see then a whole lot of activity in gaming and through your clients. You know, what sort of fraud rejection, you know, what do you have to do to reject these frauds? Is it Unbotify's technology, or is there other technologies that you use?
Yeah, so we've actually had a fraud prevention suite now for years. And I think the key here is that there's really two types of fraud out there that gaming publishers need to be aware of. So first is basically the type where you are spoofing engagements or attribution. So companies or fraudsters that are going out there and actually trying to get the payout, saying that we drove this user to install this game, right? The other type of fraud that I think is much more systemic to gaming is actually spoofing users and user activity and user behavior, which is what we want to talk about today. I think the key piece about this, though, is that a lot of companies will go out there and say, okay, we're going to get a fraud detection tool. I think that this is where we want to start. That way we can kind of learn and see how much fraud we actually have. And I like to compare this to a credit card. So I just got back from Barcelona, and let's say my credit card company called me up and said, we found fraud. You know, somebody stole your credit card, you've got $500 in fraudulent purchases, here you go. And then they say, how about you take care of that fraud? You go after it. We'll let you see that it's fraud. We've told you that it's fraud. But now you get to watch all of these additional purchases and take care of it. That's detection. And none of us would actually want that from our credit card provider, right? Like, I'm not trying to say, oh yeah, go take my credit card, have fun with it. I'll go find the person that stole it and deal with all the consequences. So it's actually critical to get a fraud prevention solution. Basically, a company that will detect the fraud in real time and reject it. That way, you're not having to go back retrospectively and have these conversations with the companies saying, hey, I want my money back. You can give them the laundry list as to how you were able to detect these different types of fraud. Click injection, click spam, distribution modeling, all the stuff that's out there. But at the end of the day, you're going to want a fraud solution that doesn't make you have to have that conversation.
Because it could take me a lot of time to explain to a credit card company what I'm talking about and why I should get my money back, and this is esoteric to them. It's not something they understand.
Exactly, and it's not something that when you were spending all of your time kind of going in, developing these really cool games, developing these amazing user experiences, you don't want to have to, at the end of every month, go back and settle up with these different companies and say, listen, I know this was fraud. I know that this was anonymous IP. I know that this was click injection, and then try to get your money back.
You'd rather it not happen.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, you know, what's the nature of the fraud that is occurring in games? Gold farming, or, you know, are people exploiting the in-game economies? What are they doing inside of the game to cause problems?
Yeah, so part of it is users are using bot services to gain an unfair advantage in the game. Now, this problem is about as old as, you know, multiplayer gaming. If you go back to RuneScape and World of Warcraft back in 2007, had a big bot problem that they actually never solved. So this never went away. If you take any kind of popular strategy MMO, and you try Googling, you know, I don't know, Clash of Clans bot, you'll get, you know, 1 million results. People build bots, and then actual players can rent those bots. So there are services, cloud-based services, where you can pay money that to attach your account to that bot. The bot will play the game for you, and will farm in-game resources and get an unfair advantage. There's also like other cases of selling either like maxed out accounts or in-game currencies, especially in games that have elements of trading, right? Like World of Warcraft, for example. You can really, if you can automate that stuff, you can kind of really hurt the game's community and annoy the real human players. And we've seen, like, on strategy games that we're working on, sometimes these bots like will usually crush humans too, right? They're pretty good at applying strategy and perfect execution. Right?
We've even seen that in professional esports matches, right? Because some of the competitors have been revealed as using aiming bots and other things to help them in professional matches, which of course is a quick route to ejection from the...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially if you're talking about a game that is making a push for esports, then fairness becomes a really big issue, right? Otherwise, like, it's not, what's the point of it?
Yeah.
But also, like, if you open Reddit for literally any successful MMO, you'll find people complaining about bots winning the game. You know, from World of EVE Online, like just literally any one of them, on mobile web games particularly.
Yeah, it is kind of corrosive if you start wondering, are the other players playing fairly? Am I competing on a level playing field? But what, you know, where are we at with fraud now and going forward? Do you think the problem is getting worse as we get larger audiences and, you know, diversity of platforms, or is it, you know, are we starting to make it better? Or, you know, where are we at? What does the future look like?
So you're talking about fraud in the user acquisition sense, or?
Both in the user...
Maybe we do Game of Thrones. I think that would be, we can do kind of a full, so Game of Thrones, obviously, big fan here, winter is here. Recently, regarding their app, or mobile game app, one of their affiliate networks drove more clicks for advertisements for them than there are people in the world in a month.
So they suspected fraud.
So, there's little hints like that, especially the phrase that everyone uses, fraudsters follow the money, right? Yeah. But it's also for any of these popular games as well, at least on the user acquisition side there, it's pretty clear if you have more clicks than you do people in the world, I think you might be a little suspicious. You might be able to call BS on that. And then we were just talking about it from the actual in-app user experience. You were able to find in 2 seconds.
Yeah, so I just Googled Game of Thrones Conquest bot. There are plenty of commercially available services that will play the game for you and basically help you progress in the game, right? A lot of these games, you get to that point where you have to pay to advance otherwise, or invest a huge amount of time. But you can also cheat, and it's cheaper.
So when you're developing a game then, especially one that may have a large audience and make a lot of money, you're making a walking target for fraudsters. What can you do to make yourself less of a target? Is there types of games, or are there things I can do within the game, or is it just I need to hire security, I need to get fraud prevention? Is that, what can you do as a developer?
Okay.
To make your
yeah,
games
so the games that are more susceptible to this kind of bot attacks are games that have either real money gaming, like gambling. That's always a big target. Because if you're playing online poker and 2 hands on the table are you and your bot, it's gonna work out probably better for you. And basically any game that has trading features that you can trade stuff in accounts is gonna be probably more attractive for fraudsters, as they can sell off the stuff that they farm in the game. And basically games that are more mid-core and above are almost always susceptible to this kind of bad behavior.
So on the obverse side, the hyper-casual games are not
Yeah,
really of interest to them.
if you're playing a bubble shooter, you're probably good.
You're okay.
Yeah.
What Katie, is there a concomitant problem with the ad fraud? You think is that growing at the same pace?
Yeah, so internally we call this kind of the nuclear arms mission crisis. And I know that sounds a little dramatic, but back when we kind of started this initiative to rid the mobile ad market of fraud, basically Sdk spoofing, which was simulating traffic or simulating in-app behavior, started on Android with your simulators, your computing cloud services. On iOS, it was device farms in Southeast Asia, and that was kind of the old school, right?
I remember pictures of cell phones on racks and one person going.
The exact same, here we go, this is the tilt, and we know the exact same behavior. And what's funny is that every time we actually reject that behavior, the fraudster becomes smarter. That's more information that they now have to trick their own system into outmaneuvering whatever fraud filter you have created. So what's interesting is a ton of clients will go out there and say, we've got our fraud detection or prevention tool, we're good to go, we're set. And I think the key piece is that any company out there that's offering a fraud suite has to constantly think about it from a fraudster's perspective, because they are exponentially growing in terms of their intelligence and their way to outmaneuver you. And so what we have seen most recently is what we call Sdk spoofing, where basically hackers will break open SSL encryption, hash signatures, and send us what looks like perfect human traffic. Literally has all of the metadata that we would expect from a human, but it's not. And I think that that's the craziest part about this is they are constantly coming up with new ways to throw off any of the filters that you have just built. So you've got to be innovative and you have to think from their perspective. And anyone out there who thinks, okay, I turned on a fraud prevention suite for a month, I'm good to go, I'm set, it's never gonna happen for me again, that is laughable. Because you are literally just throwing yourself out there for a world of hurt. And it is so much money, it's so much time. And another thing I would say to that is a lot of our clients initially will say, well, we can't handle that because our CPIs are gonna go through the roof. We're gonna have to pay so much more now to acquire users to play our games because there's so few out there. So we don't actually want to prevent this. It actually works for us, right? And I think that that's another key piece. The majority of our clients who have actually used our fraud prevention suite have had a 12% increase in their return on ad spend. And that's because they're no longer focusing on quantity, but quality.
Yeah, it's not about the number of users, it's about good users.
Quality, yeah.
Quality users.
Human users even, maybe, a few of them.
But what you're talking about reminds me of antibiotics versus bacteria. You know, we have several different antibiotics, but you use them more and more, and the bacteria get resistant.
Exactly.
And then your antibiotics don't work anymore. And
Yes.
What do I do now?
Yeah, but I think the right way to think about this is, I mean, yeah, it's a cat and mouse game, but there is actually a way to beat this, and it's about making it more expensive to attack than to defend. So if you're talking about the context of using bots for ad fraud, what we do at Unbotify and at Adjust now is we actually build a behavioral biometric model for every app, how that app's specific real authentic users behave as they go through the game's flows, right? How they go through the tutorial, how they go through a battle screen or whatever that specific game's context is. And if you're doing ad fraud, if you're trying to run an install fraud operation, your ability to create an adversarial machine learning model to understand what authentic interaction looks like on every app you want to defraud, like that's
Ridiculously expensive.
yeah, it doesn't scale nicely, which is the whole point of using bots for fraud, right? So, you know, while in security there's never like 100% bulletproof solution, it's not about making it impossible to break. If you're talking about defending against bots like political bots on Google and Twitter, you know, so you're up against the Russians or, you know, state-sponsored actors that have, you know, a lot of incentive, a lot of resources to try to break your systems. But if you're talking about the fraudsters that are in it for the money, well, it's about making it not cost-effective anymore. So, you know, you might as well try some other kind of fraud.
But even as a business, if I can take my fraud down from 20% to 2%, you know, if I can make that big, okay, 2% I can live with. 20%, I'm staying awake at night wondering why so much of my business is going out the door to other people. You know, and eventually, you know, these things are corrosive to the user community and within the game, and even for the advertising. You know, if you start wondering what of my ad spend is actually real, you know, what am I getting for it, and you start second guessing yourself to a great extent. Well, do you think that are we seeing? I mean, obviously, mobile is a key area where this occurs. Are we seeing a similar? Is the problem similar in scale on PC or console, or what? How does it compare versus mobile?
I can, if you're talking about the in-game bots. Yeah, so console is relatively much better secured than web and mobile. Web is the most open platform. It's really easy to build a bot on web to abuse any kind of game, any kind of website. And on mobile, specifically like using technologies like leveraging the sensor data, using behavioral biometrics, you can build something that's really, really difficult to break. When you're talking about consoles, you'll get mostly the signature type, Sdk spoofing type attacks. So.
Right, but they're locked down a lot more, so they have more controls
yes.
over their user base. I guess part of the question is that are you seeing this fraud? Is it occurring in or being generated from certain regions, or is it just all over the world? Is there any place that geographically that you would say you'd be more suspicious of stuff coming from an area, or do they just geo-spoof as part of their, making themselves harder to find?
Well, in ad fraud, of course, you geo-spoof because U.S. traffic is a lot more expensive than Bangladesh. But we see a lot of these click farm type operation or wet bots, as they're sometimes called, from like Vietnam and Bangladesh specifically. We've seen that a lot. But yeah.
Is this something that law enforcement is interested in pursuing at all, or is it just there's this cyber war against fraudsters going on, and law enforcement's like, we don't even understand that, or we don't care, or what?
Oh, so generally in ad fraud, there were maybe, I can think of 5 cases of people who were prosecuted for running ad fraud. It's relatively very safe and very, very lucrative. The World Federation of Advertisers has $20 billion a year is lost to advertisement fraud, right? Wow. Yeah, so, yeah, and especially like if you're in Russia, China, you're good. Nothing to fear.
If $20 billion,
unicorn.
If $20 billion was lost to bank robberies, people would be getting more security on banks, and they'd be prosecuting the bank robbers more heavily.
Yeah, advertisement fraud is the largest kind of cybercrime right now in the world, and probably the second largest organized crime operation after drug trafficking. So yeah, it's pretty big.
Well, especially if you, as a criminal, you look at it and say, well, what's my potential downside? How many people are even getting prosecuted? They may shut me down. I'll just reopen something somewhere else.
Yeah, it's much safer than.
I don't have to carry a gun. Yeah. And I don't risk getting shot, but maybe I should risk getting shot. That would be good. But where do you see us reaching a point where I don't have to worry continuously about it, or is that, you think that technically we can get there, or is it just every year, every month, every day I'm going to have to spend some time thinking about this as a game publisher? For ad fraud, you seem to think it's like, it's never ending. You never can relax.
Yeah, and it's something actually that internally we've been asked by a lot of our clients, okay, well, if you get machine learning behind it, if you guys have set up all these different filters, then you should be good to go. It can kind of just, keep iterating on itself. And I think that the key there is that while machine learning is great once you actually have the set algorithm and the set play, it's not great for identifying new methods. And there are constantly new methods. Like I was saying before, the first time that fraudster doesn't actually get the payout, gets rejected, they're going to look into what was that anomaly and what they did that was found that made their traffic not seem like a real device or a real human. And so that's where I think that when it comes to a fraud suite that constantly gives you that peace of mind where you can say, okay, I know that my traffic's solid. I know that my reference points are not diluted based on a ton of fraudulent traffic. That's where you really need a company that's constantly looking into, okay, here's the type of fraud that we're looking into. What's the next method that these fraudsters are going to use to outsmart us? And I think that that's kind of the key piece, because there's always going to be something new. And literally in the past 2 years, I think we've had 7 different filters that we have released to try to prevent basically just the spoofed attribution. And that's one type.
So what happens is that the fraudsters in general get used to a particular thing, and then they all shift to a different method, which there isn't enough protection against. And it's kind of like, Facebook ads versus, everybody's jumping into Facebook ads because those are working great. But after a while, once everybody jumps in, they won't work quite as well, so people will be looking for another thing. And this is essentially what the fraudsters are doing. Hey, this is working great for us. Oh, no, it's not working so well. We'll come up with a different way.
Exactly, and going back to the expensive point, right? So in a lot of these different methods that they've had over time, they become expensive and cost prohibitive because of what we've used to actually reject them. So they're constantly looking for that margin, right? They're looking for the method that's going to have the least cost, and the most payout from all of you guys. And I think that that's kind of the key piece. Fraud will always be prevalent as long as there is a margin within this space, a margin to be made for them.
Is there a way, when we're talking about in-game fraud and cheating, you know, people have tried locking their systems down to some extent, but is it the same kind of cat and mouse game? Is there, you know, big publishers are looking for ways to secure their in-game economies or their in-game play, but then the fraudsters find a way around it. They create new bots. Now, I have seen some prosecutions for people writing game bots. You know, there have been a handful of them, not very many. And I don't know that they got very big sentences or whatever, but those are the kind of things that an individual can just write in his garage and set it out there for sale and make some money off the sale until the company ever finds him and shuts him down. Are they looking for ways within the game itself to help prevent this or make it more difficult, raise the cost of the attacks? Do you know of publishers that are doing that?
Yeah, so changing the game economy or changing something in the, I mean, yeah, that's one way to tackle the problem. You know, I believe that there's a technology solution for this, which is stuff like what we're doing. And then when you're talking about building a technology barrier, you should also think about, you know, it doesn't have to be the, you know, 100% bulletproof. It has to be better. You know, if I have bars on my window and you don't, it doesn't matter if they're from titanium, you know, or not. You know?
Right, I'm protected, but she's not,
Yeah,
so go attack her house.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the case in security. You have to be a step above your peers. I believe that technology can solve this, and you know, but we've also seen, you know, we've seen companies move to mobile as it is a more secured platform. And I think you'll see a lot of the biggest bot targets out there. Think of apps like, I don't know, Nike, for example. Nike have a bot scalping problem that's been an ongoing war for years. And I think you can expect companies like that to move only to do like the sneaker promotions on mobile rather than web, because it is easier to secure that.
Because with mobile, you have those sensors that you can read data from and figure out a protection scheme
Exactly,
better.
yeah.
Where
You have a lot more metadata to pull from.
so, well, I think it's you know, it is a huge problem. The scope of it is kind of appalling. And are there any countries or jurisdictions that you think are taking some measures other than, you know, just
You mean legal measures?
legal? Yeah. Is there, you know, is Israel better at trying to clamp down on this than the United States, or is the EU looking at ways to do this? They seem to be busy dealing with all kinds of e-commerce. Is this something?
Yeah, well, we've seen the EU shut down bot operations, but that happens after you sue and you issue, you send them a cease and desist letter, and eventually, you know, after years of legal dispute, you can shut down a bot operation, and then they will spin up a new one with a new domain, a new company. So that's, you know, legal action is not the right way to solve this.
It's too slow and
It's too slow, and it's really easy to spin up a new entity to.
yeah, when your operation is mostly virtual, I can open a new office in some third world country that doesn't care and go there. Well, you know, are there when you advise companies, you want to advise developers what to do about this? What should my takeaway be as I prepare to launch an application, or as I have an existing application that's out there? What should I do if, you know, I hadn't been concerned about it before, I hadn't realized what the scope of it was, and holy crap, I didn't realize that I could be losing millions of dollars I didn't know. Where do I start? What do I do?
So from the advertising perspective, especially from gaming, I have what I call my 3 BS metrics, or 3 bullshits. Basically, the first one is if your click-through rate is less than 1%, fraud. Call bullshit. That's not what you should expect. The next is you all have very different LTVs, but if your LTV is super, super low, especially at that sub-publisher level, that's also a bullshit. That's not real. And then the final one, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, but if you're receiving more clicks than there are devices in the world, if you've got over 2.5 billion clicks happening within a certain time frame, also call bullshit, right? So those are kind of the easy 3 to just quickly realize. The unfortunate part is once you've been able to call bullshit, that's a little too late, right? That's retrospective, and then you still have to have the conversation. So the next piece of that is actually getting a fraud prevention suite. So basically, there's all these third parties out there that'll offer you kind of different fraud solutions where you'll be able to go in, look and say, okay, this percentage of my traffic or this percentage of my users look to have fraudulent tendencies. But at the same time, you still then have to go out and have the conversation, right the wrong at the end of the month. So you want a solution that will actually reject this fraudulent behavior in real time. And this solution has to have filters that are based on a certain confidence interval, right? You don't want solutions that are just gonna reject everything, have tons of false positives, and then kind of, obviously really affect your marketing budget. You're gonna want a solution that probably has around a 95% confidence interval and does that real-time rejection.
What about for in-game fraud? What's your recommendations to publishers as to how they can deal with that?
Yeah, well, if you're a small studio and you're launching a game, that's probably not your biggest concern. But if you have like an existing game and you want to build a community, these things can be really, really harmful in terms of creating resentment in your community. When you're playing like Counter-Strike and somebody kills you with an aimbot, you're really pissed.
Yeah, how did she beat me so easily?
Yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah. So it's probably once your game is successful, you're gonna start encountering those things more and more, and especially strategy games. As soon as they get traction, they get the bots. But also like in user acquisition. Like if you're just starting out, you'll probably put your money in Facebook and Google. But once you start, running larger UA budgets across multiple channels, or you're going to like APAC in China where there's no Google and Facebook, you're going to be much more susceptible to this kind of problem.
So as a game company, as I'm reaching a good market now, I've got 1 million users, for my strategy game. It's getting some good traction. How do I even detect fraud, especially if it's a web game? How do I know what kind of in-game fraud I'm getting? Obviously, for ads, there's good tools to detect that. What kind of detection is doable, and are there something like Katie's BS, clues for in-game fraud?
Yeah, well, when you're just starting out, you can pick out, players that play 24/7 and never sleep. That's a clear telltale.
That doesn't look right.
Yeah. And then once you start blocking the obvious stuff, these tools evolve to mimic human behavior more closely. But you will know because your players will be complaining, because your players will be churning, and it will affect your bottom line. That's a concern.
Yeah, because your player base is your first line of detection, because they'll let you know pretty quickly if hey, this seemed pretty fishy.
Yeah, and like most of these games have flagged this account as a potential bot.
Yeah.
That's not a great way to tackle that problem.
No, but at least it's a warning that this is getting to be of concern, and you really need to deal with it as substantively as you can.
Yeah.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for us at this point about either in-game fraud or advertising fraud? Something, real-world example of somebody dealing with the issue, or everything's fine with you all and there's no problem here? nothing to see move along. You know, Katie, is there something?
No fraud here. We're
no
all
fraud
good.
here. Everybody's good. Yeah, it's just disturbing to realize that the level of it has gotten so high, and at the same time as we've seen, you know, the cost of impressions and everything else going up, and realizing that part of what's boosting all that are people stealing that money.
Well, and I think I was talking to you guys, but to the point where, I don't know, how many people here have seen Wreck-It Ralph 2? Yeah, it was great, right? But once this type of fraud is now in a movie, right? I don't know if you guys realize that when you were watching it, right? But literally, these animated characters are now going and trying to steal the car that's actually worth money, right? And that's kind of the whole premise of this, is that there are basically in-app kind of currencies that everyone out there wants, that people will be willing to buy. And pretty much if that is around, then you can bet that there will be bots going after it. So highly recommend watching that movie, but also I think to the point where in an animated kids film that we have this, it's pretty systemic to the industry.
Yeah, that is scary when it reaches that level of,
right?
of public perception that, you know, even kids know that this exists, you know. And,
well, and sometimes the fraudsters, who was it? Oh, I think it was our fraud specialist who kind of says, you know, when we get those huge click-through our click rates, right, where there's more clicks than there are humans in the world, you know, let's take all of the 3-year-old trigger happies kind of out of here, take them out of the equation, then I think we know, yeah, this is seriously bullshit. Like, this is not real traffic.
Yeah, it's gotten so outrageous that they're walking down the street, knocking people over, taking their wallets in mass, and nobody's doing anything. So, well, I'm glad that you are not giving up the fight, and that you are, in fact, taking more steps than ever to try and rectify this. I think as the gaming market expands and continues to grow, we see look, projections of over $100 billion in revenue for mobile in 2021, and you know, the amount of money lost to fraud is going to continue to grow unless we make even more of a concerted effort to stop it.
Yeah.
So, so we need you on that wall, you know, with guns, hopefully shooting down some of these fraudsters. You know, hanging's too good for them, I say. But is there any other things that we should recommend to people that they do? Are there resources where they can get more information about fraud? Do you have?
So we're here. Definitely come. If I know that it's kind of a weird thing to raise your hand and say, oh, I have a ton of fraud in a big room, but we will be walking around so we can have one-on-one conversations. I think if you aren't questioning whether you have fraud, then that's kind of step one, is admitting you have a problem, right? So come and find us. Also, there's so much out there about fraud. There's tons of different companies focusing on this. We're not the only ones. I think it's great that we've kind of combined efforts, and that's always been a just kind of tried and true, is to fight this good fight against fraud, I guess. But at the same time, start to really look at your traffic, start to look at some of those key indicators, and realize that, you know, if you don't have something, your reference points and all of the traffic you're looking at, all of your typical KPIs are bogus. So you've got to kind of get started on this. It
is kind of a cancer on your business, and it can make you sick if you're not, you know, getting it under control. Yeah. Well, I think that's. I don't think we have any other anything else to add. Again, if there's any questions, now's your time to ask them. But other than that, I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you very much for joining us, and I guess, you know, when you said that about if you don't think there's a problem, that's when you have a problem. It's kind of like if you can't identify the sucker at the poker table, you're the sucker.
You're the sucker.
You know, and that's kind of what the situation is here. If you think everything's fine, you better look a little more closely, because it sure isn't fine out there. The world is a dangerous place, even in the digital world. So, thank you.
Thank y'all. Happy Wednesday.